This evening, the Senate voted 60-38 to limit debate on a bill that would reauthorize parts of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act that allow law enforcement to monitor communications of suspected terrorists abroad without a warrant. A group of senators who want judicial review of this surveillance oppose the bill. Today's vote sets up a final passage vote Wednesday, which you can watch live here on C-SPAN 2. Here's some of today's debate, beginning with three senators opposed to FISA reauthorization. Patrick Leahy, Ron Wyden, and Rand Paul.
Senator for Vermont.
Mr. President, I find myself in strong agreement with the comments of the senior senator from New York State. He's talked about 702, and let me refer to that a bit. Section 702 is in S139, the FISA Amendments Reauthorization Act of 2017. We're going to vote very soon with a cutoff debate and block any amendments on a fundamentally flawed piece of legislation that fails to reform one of our most important surveillance tools. Section 702 of the FISA Amendment Act was intended to provide for vast and powerful surveillance of foreigners overseas who might do harm to us, and it does. But the fact that it is an effective surveillance tool used against foreigners abroad is not what the concern you hear about today. Today you're going to hear a concern that Section 702 has become an unexpected and powerful domestic surveillance tool, not one directed at those abroad who might do us harm, but potentially directed at every single American in this room and throughout this country, allowing the government to search for Americans' emails and other substantive communications, do it without a warrant. The so-called backdoor loophole, if we put here legislation saying this legislation will allow our government to search all our emails without a warrant, Republicans and Democrats would be jumping up and saying, wait a minute, that violates the Fourth Amendment. Well, the legislation we're voting on today, authored by the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Devin Nunes, contains what its supporters portray as a fig leaf of reform. But in fact, the legislation makes a bad problem even worse. I'm going to oppose cutting off debate on this bill. I strongly urge my fellow senators to do the same. Not to kill the bill, but to afford us on such a critical surveillance tool the opportunity to debate the constitutional implications and to offer amendments to improve the bill and to protect Americans from every single state in this country. Now, the majority leader has provided us no such opportunity. He doesn't want us to offer any amendments, even amendments that we know could pass with a bipartisan majority. Senator Leahy and I are filing several amendments to improve this bill, including our USA Liberty Act. That's a Senate companion to a bill that was reported out of the House Judiciary Committee in a strong and very bipartisan vote. Our amendment offers a sensible compromise. It would protect national security, something that we all want to do. But it also protects American civil liberties, which I would hope we also want to do. I strongly support a warrant requirement based on Senator Feinstein's amendment in the Senate Intelligence Committee that would close the backdoor loophole. These amendments, others offered by Senators Paul and Wyden and others, deserve a vote. Senator Leahy and Senator Paul have spoken so strongly of the problems in this. They ought to be heard. They ought to have a chance to offer amendments. Instead, the only bill we're voting on today is a House bill which fails to comply with the fundamental constitutional imperative. I think we can do better in the United States Senate than to accept a flawed House bill. And do not be deceived by the sham warrant contained that newness bill. Again, why we should have a Senate bill that speaks to those things we know as senators and not the flawed warrant in the newness bill. That warrant is the exemptions are so large, it renders it meaningless. It requires a warrant only during the final stage of a criminal investigation, and only when the government believes national security or risk to life or bodily harm are not implicated at some undefined point in time. In all other cases, in previous points in investigation, the government can search for an American's information in the Section 702 database just as frequently and casually as we might look up football scores on Google. But even if it's completely ineffectual, the newness bill has a warrant requirement, and that means the sponsors of this flawed legislation acknowledge some sort of warrant is required to protect Americans' privacy. They recognize that if you search through a vast database of Americans' communications, they can trigger Fourth Amendment protections when it's convenient to the government. Problem is, the Constitution doesn't say we protect Americans' rights only if it's convenient to the government. The reason we wrote the Constitution is to make sure every one of us have our protections against the government, not just when the government feels that, okay, on this occasion, we'll let you have rights. When a Fourth Amendment interest is implicated, if they're going to come and search your files, they're going to come and search your papers, they should have to have a warrant. The Fourth Amendment either applies or it does not. If it does not, then let's have a constitutional amendment and do away with it. Nobody here would vote for that. But even the sponsors of the newness bill now agree the Fourth Amendment applies. The only question is whether we have a real warrant requirement or a warrant in name only. Simply calling something a warrant doesn't make it that. I firmly believe a real warrant requirement doesn't have to put our national security at risk. The reform proposals I support contain well-trodden exemptions for exigent circumstances to allow for emergencies. For these reasons and others, I strongly support a warrant requirement to close the backdoor loophole, and I think my fellow senators, Republicans and Democrats, ought to be allowed to at least have a vote on it. And if they don't, then I would urge my colleagues in the Senate to vote no on invoking cloture on the FISA Amendments Reauthorization Act. Now, Section 702 authorities can be temporarily extended, as they were in December. In fact, the FISA court's statutorily authorized certifications that permits 702 surveillance don't expire to the end of April. There's no emergency now. We still have the time and the ability to get this right. Let's protect the Constitution. Let's protect Americans. Majority leaders should do his part. He should allow members on both sides of the aisle who care deeply about this issue to offer amendments before any long-term authorization. I agree that Section 702 is an important tool, but this issue is far too important to rush through without adequate debate. I think we can protect our national security, but we can protect the civil liberties of law-abiding Americans. This bill falls short. I'm going to be voting no on cloture. I yield the floor.
Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, I want to thank Chairman Leahy for his excellent remarks. And let me simply say, to move forward without amendments surrenders the constitutional obligations senators have to the American people. This issue is important. It is complicated. And the American people deserve to have an opportunity for some real amendments to make sure at the end of the day we have policies that keep our people safe and protect our liberties. A bipartisan coalition of us. I see my friend from Kentucky here. He's joined by his colleague from Utah, Senator Lee, Senator Leahy, and I. Our bipartisan coalition is dedicated to essentially one mission. We think the country deserves a Senate that is very tough on terrorists. We don't take a backseat to anybody in terms of fighting terrorists. What we're opposed to is an end run on our sacred Constitution. Right now, with the changes in communication systems around the world, and communication systems increasingly becoming globally interconnected, we have more and more law-abiding Americans swept up in searches under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And as I say, we want to fight terrorists, but the law allows the government to target foreigners to acquire foreign intelligence information, which basically means anything related to the conduct of foreign affairs. So let's talk about who could get swept up in these searches, and who are the people that Senator Paul and Senator Leahy and Senator Leahy and myself and colleagues on both sides of the aisle ought to have as law-abiding Americans. We think they ought to have their constitutional rights. The kind of people who could be swept up in these communications and have their emails or texts, their data searched without a warrant, could be American business people talking to foreign contacts. It could be first, second, or third generation American immigrants talking to family and friends still overseas. American journalists covering foreign stories. U.S. service members talking to foreign friends they've made while they were deployed. American teachers and researchers seeking information from foreigners. How many Americans get swept up? We don't know. And we don't know not because of a lack of effort. We've been trying for 6 years to get the government to provide even an estimate. My concern is, on a number of these issues, to ensure that we have both safety and liberty, we've actually gone backward. In the Intelligence Committee, in an open hearing, when the Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coates, our former colleague, was asked about whether the government could collect, in effect, just wholly domestic, personal data here in the United States, we couldn't even get a straight answer with respect to whether the government, under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, could collect wholly communications. We couldn't even get a straight answer to that. So what we need is the opportunity to have a real debate. We've got a number of amendments that go right to the heart of what these issues are all about, particularly the government conducting repeated warrantless searches for Americans, even if those Americans aren't the subject of any investigation, and the government then can read those private communications. I want to put, finally, this whole issue in context. Every year, the CIA and the NSA conduct thousands of warrantless searches of 702 data for Americans. And that's just for content. The conduct of these searches, where they conduct tens of thousands of warrantless searches for communication records, the FBI is conducting these searches so frequently that they don't even count. But this bill might have some marginal effect on one of those searches. So the House bill is not just fake reform. It's a setback. And the last point I would make is we finally made some headway with respect to collection of communications that are neither to nor from a foreign target but are simply about a foreign target. I went after this issue for years, this question of abuse of what's called abouts collection. Finally, the government realized it was going too far, and they put limits on it. Now it looks like they want to get back in the business, and the other body, the House, basically creates a path to going back to abouts collection, which even the government has admitted has been abused. There is an opportunity, Mr. President, if we vote to allow some amendments to come up with policies that will allow Americans to look at the Senate and say, we didn't go backward, we went forward, we protected law-abiding Americans, but we made it clear we were going to be relentless in our search for terrorists. I know I had a little bit more time, but I see my colleague and partner, Senator Paul, on the floor, and with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kentucky.
I rise in opposition to the government listening to your phone calls, reading your emails, or reading your text messages without a warrant. Doesn't mean the government will never do this, but it means they would have to ask a judge. They would have to ask a judge if they have probable cause that you've committed a crime. They would have to name you. They would have to name the information they want. It's called the Fourth Amendment. All Americans deserve the protection of the Fourth Amendment. In fact, I believe it was John Adams who said that James Otis's argument against blanket warrants, against generalized warrants that they called writs of assistance, he said that that argument that James Otis made in the 1760s was the spark that led to the American Revolution. Lincoln is said to have written that any man can stand adversity, but if you want to challenge a man or a woman, give them power. It's really been the history of Western civilization over almost 1,000 years, the struggle to contain the power of the monarch, the struggle to maintain and contain the power of the government in every form. From the Magna Carta on, it has been the people trying to take power back from either monarchy or despotic government. We get to the formation of our government, and Jefferson wrote that the Constitution would be the chains, that the government would be bound up in the chains. Patrick Henry wrote that the Constitution is meant to restrain the government, not the people. It is about trying to restrain government from abusing the power to take our rights. You have a fundamental right to be left alone. Justice Brandeis put it this way. He said, the right most cherished among civilized men and women is the right to be left alone. But we know also that the history of those who grab the reins of power, the history of those who take up the mantle of power, is a history of abuse. President Wilson in World War I arrested 10,000 Americans for their objection to the war. FDR had an enemies list that he actually was very vocal and published in newspapers, 77 people that were his enemies, and he used the IRS to go after them. LBJ illegally spied on Martin Luther King. We just had Martin Luther King Day yesterday. LBJ spied on him illegally in all manners, in all forms. They spied on Vietnam War veterans. Nixon had an enemies list. You name it, president after president has abused this power. President Obama had a fight with the Tea Party groups. It turns out that to register as a Tea Party group was given extra scrutiny, and people were denied being allowed to form as a charitable group or a political activist group under President Obama because they disagreed with President Obama. We now have a current administration where there have been accusations of people in the FBI having a personal animus against this president and conspiring and discussing how they could block him. We've had members of the Department of Justice who were married to people doing opposition research on President Trump, paid for by the opposition candidate, by Hillary Clinton. There is without question that power has been abused and will always be abused. It was Lord Acton who said that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The history of our country is about trying to restrain the power of government. Realize that we have the ability to collect all of the phone calls in Italy in 1 month. There was a story saying we did it. We collected every phone call from Italy. Who gets trapped in that? If you collect everyone's phone calls in Germany or everyone's phone calls in Jordan, who gets caught in that? Many, many innocent, legitimate Americans get caught up in the other end of phone calls because it's not just the phone calls of terrorists, it's everybody's phone calls. They're all being vacuumed up, and innocent Americans are caught up in that. Senator Wyden has been a leader in saying and asking tough questions on the Intelligence Committee. Are there communications that are purely between two people in America that somehow get caught in this database? And he's been given a variety of answers on this, but we suspect that Americans talking to Americans in this country are caught up in this database. Should the government be allowed to search this database to prosecute you for IRS, for not paying your taxes, for a minor marijuana violation? Absolutely not. Why? Because this information is gathered without a warrant. It is gathered without any constitutional protection. And as others have said, we actually are okay with a lower standard for gathering foreign intelligence. We acknowledge the Constitution doesn't apply to everybody in the world. But if Americans get caught up in that, Americans deserve the protection of the Constitution. Now, some on the other side have started saying, well, it's lawfully gathered, so it can be used for any lawful purpose. That is the most ridiculous argument I have ever heard. It's gathered lawfully for foreigners, and we made the standard 0. There is no constitutional protection. We never said we're going to gather foreigners' information, put it in a big pool, mix it up with Americans' information, and then type your name in, John Smith, and then find out who you've been talking to. Realize that they could listen to your conversation, then they could bring you in for an interview with the FBI, and if you say anything in the interview that contradicts what they eavesdropped on you in your conversation, you've now committed a felony. Do we really want all of our phone calls recorded and then have the ability of the government to bring you in and ask you questions about your phone calls? And if you're not perfectly accurate in recording your phone calls, you could go to prison? All we're asking for is that for Americans, the Constitution should be in order. We should not get rid of the Constitution. We shouldn't throw it out. The Constitution should protect us all. We take an oath of office to defend the Constitution. Our soldiers take the same oath of office. Wouldn't it be sad if our soldiers came home from fighting and defending the Constitution to learn that we gave up on it while they were gone? The sad state of affairs here is that the majority doesn't want any debate. They want to ram this through with no amendments. Senator Wyden and I have worked for months on amendments and on an alternative bill which actually reauthorizes the program. Senator Leahy and Lee have another bill that's similar that replaces the program. None of us are for ending the program. We're all for saying if you want to look at an American's information, you got to get a warrant. People say it'll slow us down. All of our bills have an emergency exception. If they declare an emergency, they can look at the information and get the warrant the next day. We hope that that would be extraordinary and not the norm. So the thing is we want the program to work, but we don't want Americans caught up in it. I hope that senators will think this through. This will not kill the program. They're going to scare you to death and say, tomorrow we're all going to, die and the world's going to be taken over by terrorists if we don't have this. If we win this vote tonight, they'll be negotiating within an hour and we'll come to a compromise that allows the Constitution to protect Americans. That was our oath of office. That is what we should do, and I urge a vote against the bill in a current fashion.
Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
I stand today in support of S-139, the FISA Amendment Reauthorization Act. As we know, the first responsibility of government, of this United States government, is to protect our citizens. To do so, we must make sure that those who protect us have the tools to keep us safe. This bill does exactly that. It provides the intelligence community and law enforcement with the right tools. but it also mines the civil liberties and the privacy protections that our Constitution requires, especially given the ever-changing technological landscape. The importance of our country's safety and security has been highlighted in several events from just the past 2 years. Now, we often get lost in the constant news cycle, but let's not forget that New York City suffered 3 significant terrorist attacks in the last 15 months alone. September 2016, a terrorist detonated a pressure cooker bomb in New York's Chelsea neighborhood. A second pressure cooker bomb was found a few blocks away, but didn't detonate. Earlier the same day, a bomb went off near the start of the Marine Corps charity race. This past October, Saiful Saipov drove a rented truck onto the bike lane and pedestrian walkway at the West Side Highway. He mowed down numerous civilians, killing 8 and injuring 12. And this past December, another one detonated a bomb in New York City subway tunnel to the Port Authority bus terminal, injuring several people near him. He told investigators that he did it in the name of ISIS. In June 2016, Omar Mateen shot and killed 49 and injured 53 others in Orlando, also an act in the name of ISIS. In September 2016, a terrorist stabbed 10 people in the mall, St. Cloud, Minnesota. November 2016, a terrorist injured 13 after driving into and trying to stab students and teachers at Ohio State. And in December 2015, we had the San Bernardino shooting, where terrorists killed 14 and injured 22. We've also seen terrorist incidents involving around the world, especially impacting our friends in Europe. In the UK alone, there have been at least a half a dozen terrorist attacks in the past years, including a subway bombing in London, injuring 30 people, a van plowing down pedestrians on the London Bridge, injuring 48 and killing 8, and the Manchester concert bombing, in which 22 people were killed, and the attack on British Parliament in London, killing 4, including a person from Utah. All of these attacks and more show the threats are real, and we must protect our country by lawful constitutional means. Congress has done so by providing lawful authority such as Section 702. The 702 program has been called the most significant tool in the NSA arsenal for the detection and disruption of terrorist threats. The NSA director has said publicly that there is no alternative way to replicate 702 collection. Some estimates that over 25% of all current U.S. intelligence is based upon Section 702. There are some key examples. Haji Iman rose from a high school teacher to become the second in command of ISIS. He was the main focus of NSA's counterterrorism efforts. The United States government offered a $7 million reward for information leading to his capture. We spent over 2 years looking for him. He was ultimately captured based almost exclusively on intelligence information from 702. Zazi is in prison for planning an attack of the New York City subway systems with explosives in 2009. He received explosive training in Pakistan from Al-Qaeda. He was discovered after he corresponded with an email address used by an Al-Qaeda courier in Pakistan seeking advice on how to build explosives. The 702 program uncovered the correspondence. Without that discovery, the subway bombing plot might have succeeded. October 2013, the FBI began investigating Sean Parson, a foreigner from Trinidad and Tobago after Parson began posting comments online expressing a desire to commit attack against Western interests. Information collected through 702 revealed Parsons' efforts and was instrumental in identifying additional members of Parsons' network. Through the 702 program, the FBI assisted foreign partners to identify the individual who committed the 2016 New York Eve's terrorist attack at a nightclub in Turkey. During that attack, 38 people were killed, including an American citizen. And those are just from unclassified examples. It is important to remind my colleagues of the purpose behind 702. It provides the government the authority to collect the electronic communications of foreigners located outside of the United States. Under 702, it's against the law to target anyone in the United States or any American citizen, wherever that citizen is in the world. The program is targeted. It is not a bulk collection system. Furthermore, the FISA court must approve targeting procedures to ensure that only appropriate individuals are subject to surveillance. Minimization procedures limit the handling and use of information that is collected. All three branches of government have a hand in overseeing the program to protect the constitutional rights of the American people. It is also important to remind my colleagues that this legislation was first signed into law in 2008. When we took up consideration in 2012 and debated the law, we authorized this legislation with no changes. The 2012 clean reauthorization had the full support of President Obama. Some of our Senate colleagues oppose this bill. Their first and most consistent claim is that Section 702 violates the Fourth Amendment. Our colleagues claim that it is an end run around the Constitution. Others call it a legal loophole, a backdoor, or warrantless surveillance. Nothing could be further from the truth. Section 702 is fully consistent with the Constitution. Every federal court to review 702, even including the very liberal Ninth Circuit, has upheld the law. The Supreme Court's recent decision to deny review of the Ninth Circuit case lets stand that court's decision. These courts consistently determine that a warrant is not required to collect or query 702 information. Moreover, the Independent P Club Review Board has reviewed the entire legal framework of 702 and also found it to be constitutional. The other main claim against this bill is that it provides new powers to the government. Again, this is not true. Nevertheless, this bill does include some significant reforms. First, the bill requires the FBI to get a warrant in some criminal cases. In other words, we've added a warrant where courts have held none are necessary. The bill also provides protection for whistleblowers and requires an Inspector General report. In short, this bill provides our government the tools it needs to protect our national security while providing some much-needed transparency measures and increased privacy and civil liberties protections. So you can tell, I'm very strongly in support of this legislation. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this very important national security protection legislation. I yield the floor.
Senator from North Carolina.
Mr. President, I want to thank the chairman of the Judiciary Committee for his support, but more importantly, for his very in-depth analysis of how this works and why it is constitutional. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that Senator Warner and I be permitted to complete our remarks prior to the cloture vote.
Objection.
With that, I would yield to the Vice Chairman of the Intelligence Committee.
Mr. President.
Senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, first of all, I want to thank my friend and chairman of our committee, Senator from North Carolina, for his work on this important piece of legislation. I obviously rise today in support of the passage of Senate 139, the FISA Amendments Reauthorization Act of 2017. This bill would provide significant reforms that enhance the civil liberties and privacy protections of individuals while preserving an authority critical to our national security for an additional 6 years. As Vice Chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, I have long advocated for reforms to surveillance authorities that balance the imperatives of national security and counterterrorism with the privacy rights and civil liberties of Americans. Section 702 stands among the most important of our intelligence programs. To illustrate, I'd like to highlight very briefly one recently declassified success story involving a terrorist by the name of Haji Imam. Mr. Imam was the second in command of ISIS based in Syria. NSA spent more than 2 years looking for him. This search was ultimately successful, primarily because of FISA Section 702. NSA used collection permitted and authorized under Section 702 to collect intelligence on close associates and the network supporting Mr. Imam, including their location in Syria. Between 702 and other intelligence that was developed, the IC was able to track down the movements of Mr. Imam and ultimately result in taking him off the battlefield. This is but one of numerous examples in which information obtained pursuant to Section 702 has proven critical to addressing threats to Americans both domestically and abroad. For much of the past year and a half, I've worked closely with Chairman Burr and a bipartisan group of senators to pass legislation to reauthorize Section 702 for an extended period while incorporating substantive reforms. In October, our Senate Intelligence Committee passed in a bipartisan way a vote of 12-3 comprehensive reauthorization legislation. Since that time, we've worked with our counterparts in the House as well as representatives of the executive branch to ensure that the final bill that we'll be voting on tonight and tomorrow garner widespread bipartisan support and include enhancements to civil liberties and privacy protections. The bill before us here today is a product of extensive bipartisan, bicameral negotiations. Now, this bill's not perfect, but rarely have I worked on or voted on a bill anywhere that's perfect. But I believe this measure represents a significant compromise and preserves the operational flexibility of Section 702 while instituting key reforms to further protect U.S. personal privacy. Let me take a moment to identify a few key items in this legislation that I believe bear mentioning. First, and I've seen my friend from Oregon who has argued long and hard in committee for this provision like this. He would like to see it broader, but that does include a warrant requirement. For the first time in Section 702, the government would be required to obtain a court order before FBI criminal investigators are permitted to view communications collected pursuant to Section 702 concerning a known U.S. person. Such a court order, based on probable cause, would apply in the context of criminal investigations opened by the FBI that do not relate to national security. This bill also mandates a study be conducted by the Inspector General of the Department of Justice of FBI's querying practices 1 year following the enactment of this legislation, making sure that such practices have been approved by the FISA court and implemented appropriately by the executive branch. This is an important provision in ensuring transparency. It includes an assessment of the interpretations of the FBI and the DOJ of querying procedures. It includes the handling by FBI of individuals whose citizenship status is unknown at the time of query is conducted. And it includes the scope of access by the FBI's criminal division to 702 information. Well, this will not answer all of the questions asked by my good friend from Oregon, it will finally put the FBI on record answering questions that I believe he and other members deserve to know. In addition, in terms of querying procedures, S-139 includes a section mandating a new series of procedures to be drafted and approved by the court and implemented by executive branch agencies. The legislation also requires new public reporting of statistics about activities conducted under FISA. And as been mentioned by the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, S-139 for the first time extends whistleblower protections to contractors in the intelligence community. This addition is essential to ensure that those in the IC have an avenue to report abuses. Mr. President, Congress must not further delay consideration of a long-term reauthorization. We've been debating this issue for the past 18 months. Indeed, Congress has known about this deadline since the prior reauthorization occurred in 2012. Numerous committees have had extensive hearings on this important issue, including in our committee, both open and closed hearings. I believe this bill will strengthen and protect Americans. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this legislation. I thank the President, and again, want to thank my friend, the chairman of this committee, the senator from North Carolina. Look forward to his comments. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and yield back to the chairman.
Mr. President.
Senator from North Carolina.
Mr. President, I thank the Vice Chairman of the committee, and I say to those that are opposed to this, I have great affection for all of them. They have passion that really displays their belief that the American people need to be protected from government. And let me just say from the start, this is the single most reviewed program that exists in the federal government. This is reviewed congressionally, it's reviewed by the courts, it is reviewed by the DNI, it is reviewed by the Inspector General of the Department of Justice, because we realize on the committee that this requires not just the stamp of approval from Congress, but the assurance by the Intelligence Committee and by every branch of government that it lives within the parameters we've set. I'm not sure that anybody could have heard a more thorough description than what Senator Warner just gave, and a more overwhelming voice of support than what the chairman of the Judiciary Committee gave, Senator Grassley. But let me take head on a couple of issues that have come up and claims that have been made on this floor this afternoon. One is that this is unconstitutional. Well, let me just be clear. This has been tested in the courts, and the courts have ruled that this program is lawful and it is constitutional. So any claim outside of that is not a claim from the judiciary, which we trust. It is a claim from an individual, and I believe that we should, in this case, trust the courts. But let me say here that Congress recognized the constitutionality of Section 702 when it reauthorized the bill in 2012. Further, federal courts have consistently upheld the constitutionality of 702. For example, in the United States versus Mohammed, 9th Circuit, December 5th, 2016, the court unanimously held that no warrant is required for a search targeted at a foreign person abroad who lacks Fourth Amendment rights, even though some U.S. persons' communications are incidentally acquired in that collection. The court found that Section 702 collection was reasonable under the Fourth Amendment, reasonableness balancing test, and the targeting and minimization procedures sufficiently protected the defendant's privacy issues. It's contrary to things that you heard on this floor in the last hour. But this is the 9th Circuit Court, December 5th, 2016, making a ruling based upon this incidental collection that applies to U.S. citizens. What the Vice Chairman just shared with you is we went a step further. We didn't leave it just with the court to determine constitutionality and the lack of a Fourth Amendment protection. We put into the bill that if it didn't have a national security implication. If it was a criminal act and it was going to be prosecuted in the courts that way, that before they could look at the content of that communication, it required them to go to the court and seek and get a warrant before, in fact, they could look at content. So not only do we have the courts on our side saying there's no Fourth Amendment protection, we've gone a step further and said in the case of U.S. citizens, if in fact they were incidentally collected and if in fact the information that was in the database is going to be used for a criminal case, Senator Paul talked about marijuana. They would have to actually go to a court and get a warrant from a judge to look at that content, which means that you're going to have an FBI agent that's going to make a determination as to whether the content of that message is valuable enough to go to the courts and seek a warrant. This is a protection for the American people. It is not a requirement for the Fourth Amendment or for the constitutionality of 702. Now, let me just say to my colleagues who, if there are any on the fence post, the Director of National Intelligence is off the floor. He's in the Vice President's room. If you need one of the guys that has to oversee this program, who understands the importance of it, he's here. He's ready to talk to any member. Why? Because 702 is the single most important national security tool that we have in the United States. You see, if you ask me to sum up, what is this bill for? This is to allow government to keep the American people safe. This bill does more to allow law enforcement and intelligence and the Congress of the United States and the executive branch to assure the American people of their safety. That's at the heart of what Congress is established for. Spending, all these things come after that. But defense of the country, defense of each individual American is what's at the root of our responsibilities. And 702, as it relates to this age of terrorism, is the single most effective tool that we have to assure the American people that we're doing everything we can to provide their safety. I might add to that from a standpoint of the international collection and the international cadre of terrorists, we're able to share with other countries in a way that nobody else can when their country is in jeopardy of a terrorist attack. And we have multiple examples where we have shared with our partners around the world, and I might add, we don't necessarily require them to be a partner of ours to share this with them. We take countries that we have no relationship with, maybe that we don't like too much. But America is unique. If we see that there's a terrorist attack that's imminent, we will share that with any country in the world, even our hardened enemies. So let me put aside for any question that Section 702 is lawful and it's constitutional. Let me go to the rigorous oversight that I think that the Vice Chairman described. It's overseen by the Foreign Intelligence Service Court. It's overseen by the Department of Justice and the IG. It's overseen by the Congressional Intelligence Committee. It's required to be evaluated on an annual basis by the Justice Department and by the Bureau for procedures that they have to follow. I can't stress enough that the committee, your colleagues in Congress, are the ones that you should feel most confident at reviewing and providing proper oversight for this program. You see, it's those individuals that reach the clarity that's needed for this body and for the Congress to look at the American people and say, we haven't crossed the line. We've stayed within the legal box that was created. But don't leave it to me. Let's use the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, or as we like to refer to it as the PCLOP. In 2014, following an extensive review, PCLOP specifically noted in that review to date, there are no known instances which government personnel deliberately violated the statute, targeting procedures or minimization procedures. Let me say that again. The Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, which many here created, came out and in their report said To date, there are no known instances in which the government personnel deliberately violated the statute targeting procedures or minimization. At the same time, in that report, PCOP made a number of recommendations to the government intended to enhance the safeguards for privacy and civil liberties in Section 702. In February 2016, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board reported that all of its recommendations had been implemented in full or in part by the government. Let me say that again. In February 2016, every recommendation that the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board made about this program, the PCLOP certified that those had in full or in part been adopted by the federal government. If you only go on what you heard over the last half an hour or an hour, you would think that this is riddled with questions of constitutionality and that there are massive abuses. The fact is there have not been any, and the courts have ruled that it is constitutional, it is legal, and it does not infringe on the Fourth Amendment at all. Well, let me say to my colleagues, I expected we'd be here. We had a heated debate in the committee. The presiding officer remembers that well because he's on the committee. We considered a lot of amendments. And at the end of the day, we came out with a bill that's very similar to what we have today. 12-3 vote. Shows a tremendous bipartisan support. Now, if Senator Warner had written it by itself, it would probably look different. If I had written it by myself, it would probably look different. What we're asked to vote on today is a bill that looks different than what we passed out. It's a little bit stronger from a standpoint of the protection of privacy because it does institute this warrant requirement if, in fact, you want to see the content of any collection out of 702 that's dealing with a criminal process. But if it's national security, we're doing exactly what I think the American people want us to do. We're using the data that we've got to find the people that want to commit these acts and stop them before they do it. That's not the intent of this, then this probably shouldn't exist. If anybody believes that terrorists have quit and we're no longer a target, then eliminate this. I'm closer to the line than I ever thought I would be before I got to the United States Senate, and certainly before I became the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. But I do understand responsibilities. Responsibilities make sure that those individuals who we charge with protecting the American people have the tools they need to accomplish it. It's the reason we're debating on this floor and at the other end of the Capitol the funding of our military. It's to make sure that our military has the tools they need to go out and do the mission they've been asked to do. Well, from the Bureau to the intelligence community, we've asked them to do everything they can to make sure Americans stay safe. And this tool has been the most effective tool, with no abuses to date, and that's the determination of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, not a right-leaning institution. And the fact is that the government has lived exactly within the letters of the law that we have described. So I would urge my colleagues to vote for cloture. Let's move on to the 30 hours on this bill, if that's what, in fact, everybody demands. We have already extended it temporarily. That's not a sign of confidence to those who work in the trenches and we ask to keep us safe. Let's do the bold thing. Let's finish this. This is a bicameral, bipartisan, negotiated bill. Both sides of the aisle, both ends of the Capitol, it is time that we do our business. I urge my colleagues to vote yes for cloture. I yield the floor.
Senator from Oregon.
President, I would ask unanimous consent to speak for up to 2 minutes.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President, I thank my colleagues. I'll be very brief. Colleagues, what we are debating is whether the Senate will be the Senate. If you vote in favor of this, you're voting for cloture. There will be no amendments then. We would have the opportunity, if we vote against cloture, for improving this bill. And I want to emphasize that if we take a short time to improve this bill, as Senator Leahy wants to do, and Senator Leahy and Senator Paul, this program continues to operate. It is not in any way going to harm our ability to fight terrorism. This program would stand. I urge my colleagues to vote to carry out our constitutional obligations as senators, to have real debates, vote against cloture. I yield.
The Senate later voted to limit debate on FISA reauthorization. This allows for a final passage vote on the Senate floor today.